Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. April 21st, 1945. Deep in the woods between Duisburg and Lindorf, Germany. Imagine the silence. Heavy, suffocating, broken only by the wind rustling the spring leaves overhead. In a secluded forest glade stands a solitary figure, Field Marshal Walter Model. His posture is rigid, almost statuesque, yet there is no glory in his stance, only gravity. In his hand, the cold steel of his service pistol. Around him, no soldiers, no staff, no orders barked into radios. Just the ghosts of a shattered command. Army Group B, once a formidable force, now reduced to memory. Over 300,000 men having laid down their arms to the Americans in the past few days. Now pause and step into his boots. What would you do faced with this moment? Model had sworn an oath, a sacred pact not to surrender. And he would not, could not, bear to see the homeland he'd served for decades fall under Soviet hands. The decision before him wasn't truly a decision. It was the only path left for a man of his code. A single shot echoed through the trees, and with it, not just the end of one life, but the symbolic collapse of something much greater. A tide that had swept across Germany's war machine and confounded military historians ever since. Between March and May 1945, an astonishing spectacle unfolded. Close to 3 million German soldiers surrendered en masse, not to the Soviets, but to American and other Western Allied forces. They marched through their own defenses to reach the enemy, eager to escape a fate they feared more than death itself. They didn't fight. They didn't resist. Instead, they raised white flags made from curtains and linens, stepped out of trenches, and approached Allied lines empty-handed. Why? Not because they had no bullets left, not because their fortifications had failed, and not even because the war clearly was lost. No, they surrendered with one desperate aim: to avoid falling into the hands of the Soviet Red Army. The statistics are staggering. From the iconic D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, until April 30, 1945, the day Hitler took his own life in a Berlin bunker, the Western Allies accepted over 2.8 million German POWs on the Northwestern European front. Astonishingly, 1.5 million of them gave up in just April 1945 alone. During the first 2 weeks of that month, an average of 39,000 Germans surrendered each day. In the final 2 weeks, that number climbed to 59,000 per day. Let that sink in. These were not broken men without options. The Nazi regime still held power. Hitler still lived. Military discipline remained intact. These soldiers had guns. They had ammo. They held fortified positions. What they lacked was the will to turn and face the East, because they knew, oh, how they knew, what awaited them if they did. They had seen the Red Army's advance, relentless and fueled by the fury of a nation wronged. They had heard the stories, whispered in barracks, passed in censored letters, etched into the hollow gazes of those transferred from the Eastern Front. These tales were not the stuff of propaganda. They were real, raw, and terrifying. They had heard of Stalingrad. February 1943. 91,000 German troops of the once proud 6th Army surrendered. Only around 6,000 ever returned to Germany. The rest perished, starved, frozen, worked to death under the yoke of Soviet captivity. They knew of the death marches, grueling treks deep into Russia with no food, no rest, no mercy. Fall behind, you were shot. They knew of the mines of Siberia, the factories of the Urals, the labor camps that consumed lives like fuel. Over 1 million German POWs never made it home, dying before 1956. This was not a possibility. It was, for them, an inevitability. So, faced with that choice, what would you do? These soldiers chose the path of surrender, not to save the Reich, but to save their lives from the East. A wave of capitulation, vast and voluntary, flowed westward in April 1945 and in a forest clearing near Lindorf. As Field Marshal Model pulled the trigger, that wave reached its symbolic peak. What drives a man to walk, unarmed, into the arms of his enemy? To answer that, we must go deeper than numbers, beyond even the grim odds of survival. Yes, they mattered. The Maschke Commission, established in post-war West Germany to document the fate of POWs, determined that 194,250 German prisoners perished in Soviet captivity out of 360,000 taken. For any German soldier contemplating surrender, those were odds too dark to ignore. 1 in 3 never came home, and that was after the bullet stopped flying. But the terror that pushed so many German soldiers west wasn't merely a fear of death. It was something darker, something earned. From June 22nd, 1941, the day Operation Barbarossa shattered the peace and launched the largest land invasion in the history of warfare, Germany's campaign in the Soviet Union was not simply military. It was ideological. The men who crossed that border did so not just as soldiers, but as agents of a doctrine that declared Slavic peoples Untermenschen, subhumans fit for no future except enslavement or extermination. This wasn't metaphor. It was policy. Nazi planners had drawn up cold, bureaucratic schemes for the starvation of 30 million Soviet civilians, all to clear Lebensraum, living space, for future German colonists. On the battlefield, the Wehrmacht carried out these plans with brutal efficiency. Of 5.7 million Soviet prisoners of war, an estimated 3.3 million were deliberately starved to death. A staggering 57% died, in stark contrast to the 3.5% of British and American POWs who perished in German custody. And that's not all. German soldiers had participated directly in the Holocaust on Soviet soil, where 2 million Jews, of the total 6 million murdered, were slaughtered. Entire villages were burned to the ground. Partisans and civilians alike were executed, often together, often indiscriminately. Families were obliterated in a single day under collective punishment policies. Behind the numbers lies a single truth. 26 million Soviet soldiers and civilians died in this war, and their blood ran through German hands. And the Germans knew it. They may not have personally lit the match or pulled the trigger, but by 1945, every German soldier understood what they had collectively done in the East. They knew, with a clarity sharpened by guilt, that the Red Army would not arrive as neutral conquerors. They would come as avengers. And then came the Americans. From the very first engagements, the contrast between East and West could not have been more jarring. Picture it. German soldiers who had spent years soaking in Nazi propaganda about the barbaric West suddenly encountering American troops who upheld the Geneva Convention to the letter. Orders from General Dwight D. Eisenhower were clear. POWs were to be treated in accordance with international law. German prisoners received medical care, food rations, humane treatment, no executions, no torture, no forced labor outside Geneva provisions. Word spread, not by rumor, but by sight. In many cases, Germans could see their captured comrades in open holding areas just behind the American lines, alive, intact, being fed. That image, more than any whisper, drove the next wave of decisions. The knowledge that surrender to the Americans might not mean death, but survival sent a shockwave through German ranks. Take the Ruhr Pocket, April 1945. Between the 14th and 18th, some 317,000 German soldiers laid down their arms, not in a chaotic collapse, but in a calculated mass movement. They faced a closing trap, dwindling supplies, and a crossroads. Flee east toward tenuous German lines in the oncoming Soviets, or head west into American custody. Field Marshal Model, already defeated in spirit, had refused a formal surrender. But in doing so, he had implicitly granted his soldiers the freedom to choose their fate. And they did. They went west, not simply to save themselves, but to save what might remain of their country. By May 1945, many Germans, officers and soldiers alike, saw the writing on the wall. The Third Reich was finished. But perhaps Germany itself didn't have to be. If any hope remained for a post-war future, it would lie in American mercy, not Soviet domination. The mass surrenders were more than desperate retreats. They were the first decisions of a defeated people looking to rebuild, not be erased. But these choices hadn't emerged in a vacuum. The tide had turned months earlier, with the Allied landings at Normandy on June 6, 1944. As American, British, and Canadian troops clawed their way onto French soil, the vice on Germany's western front began to tighten. It was slow, methodical, and unstoppable. By September, France was liberated, the Reich was contracting, and the German soldier could already see where the road led, to a final choice between vengeance and mercy, between annihilation and survival. By December 1944, the noose had drawn tight. Despite the fierce counterattack and the Battle of the Bulge, the Allies stood firm, and by the end of the year, their boots pressed against Germany's western border. In the east, a far more menacing tide had risen, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. The Soviet juggernaut, forged in the fires of Stalingrad and sharpened across years of relentless offensives, was now thundering west. Then came Operation Bagration, launched on June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after Barbarossa. Bagration struck with ferocity unmatched in scale or devastation. In just 9 weeks, Army Group Center, once the backbone of Germany's Eastern Front, was annihilated. The cost? Between 400,000 and 450,000 German casualties, the single largest defeat in German military history. By January 1945, the Red Army had pierced deep into East Prussia, standing just 100 miles from Berlin. Germany was being crushed in a vice, a dual-front catastrophe. On one side, the Western Allies, on the other, the Soviets, and in the middle, a Wehrmacht drained of men, crippled by Allied bombing, and starving for fuel. The military calculus was hopeless, but for the average German soldier, the decisive factor was not just who was winning, it was who would be waiting when the war ended. 2 fronts, 2 enemies, 2 drastically different futures. The German High Command saw this with brutal clarity, and in early 1945, they began to act. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who stepped into the role of Reich president after Hitler's suicide on April 30th, pursued what historians would later call a strategy of successive, partial capitulations in the West. His objective, confirmed in now declassified documents housed in the National Archives, was chillingly pragmatic: sacrifice the East. Dönitz aimed to buy time to funnel as many German units as possible westward, not to fight, but to surrender. The goal was to place them into American or British custody, sparing them from the Soviet Gulag or Yugoslav reprisals. And so, in the war's final days, Germany began to negotiate its own unraveling. On April 29, 1945, German forces in Italy capitulated. On May 4th, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery accepted the surrender of all German troops in northwest Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark. 2 days later, General Alfred Jodl arrived at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, France. His proposal? Capitulate to the west, continue resisting the east. The old plan: divide the victors, save the army, preserve a future. But General Eisenhower would have none of it. His answer was as blunt as it was final. If Germany refused unconditional surrender on all fronts, the Western Allies would seal their lines. Every German soldier trying to flee the Soviets would be forced into their arms instead. Cornered with no path left to negotiate, Jodl signed the unconditional surrender at 2:41 a.m. May 7, 1945, in Reims. But for the Soviets, that wasn't enough. Suspicious, rightly, that they were being cut out of the moment of triumph, they demanded their own ceremony. The official surrender, as far as Moscow was concerned, took place the next day, May 8th, in Berlin-Karlshorst, in the presence of Soviet command. Only then, in their view, did the war in Europe truly end. But for tens of thousands of Germans, the end had not yet come. They were trapped, not in ideas or politics, but in the cauldron of Halbe. Between April 24th and May 1st, 1945, in the dying embers of the war, the remnants of the German Ninth Army, about 200,000 troops and countless civilians, were encircled southeast of Berlin by advancing Soviet forces. Their commander, General Theodor Busse, knew what awaited if they stayed, and so, with American positions along the Elbe River just miles away, he made a final desperate call: break out west or die trying. And so began the Battle of Halbe, a week-long slaughter. Soviet artillery rained destruction, followed by tanks, infantry, and scorched earth tactics. German soldiers, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with one purpose: not to win, but to survive long enough to reach the Americans. It was a battle not of conquest, but of escape. In the end, around 30,000 Germans made it through. A partial success, but bought at a terrible price. Casualties in the Halbe pocket are estimated between 24,000 and 60,000, including civilians caught in the storm. Now compare that to the Ruhr pocket, where between April 14 and 18, 317,000 German troops surrendered to the Americans. Only about 10,000 died, a number that included civilians, foreign laborers, and irregular fighters. The numbers tell a simple truth. When given a choice, German soldiers chose American surrender over Soviet vengeance. The post-war reckoning confirmed it. The Maschke Commission, led by Erich Maschke, recorded the grim tally of the 3 million Germans taken prisoner by the Soviet Union. 1,094,250 died in captivity. Of these, 549 out of 360 perished before May 1945. But another 542, now 911, died between May 1945 and June 1950, long after the guns had fallen silent. Even in peace, the dying continued for those who had surrendered to the east. In the final weeks of the war, white flags bloomed across Germany like spring blossoms. Towns and cities surrendered not after fierce resistance, but with barely a shot fired. At times, resistance was symbolic, a gesture to preserve honor before the inevitable. German units, rather than digging in, would retreat, only to surrender at the next checkpoint. The numbers tell the story in cold, unflinching detail. In March 1945, British and American forces captured 10,000 German soldiers each day. In the first half of April, That number quadrupled to 39,000 daily. In the final 16 days of the month, the wave crested at an astounding 59,000 prisoners per day. But these weren't the spoils of combat alone. Many were voluntary surrenders. Soldiers who had abandoned fortified lines, who had walked out of bunkers and trenches not under fire, but under their own volition. They made a choice, deliberate, calculated, clear-eyed. Think of it from their perspective. To stand and fight the Americans was to die for days, only to hand the country over to the Soviets regardless. To retreat eastward was to walk straight into Soviet captivity, a gamble they already knew had deadly odds. Only the Americans offered a narrow path forward to life, to a future, to the hope of rebuilding. By May 1945, more and more Germans, not just soldiers, but officers, civilians, intellectuals, understood a simple truth. Germany's survival depended on American mercy. Surrendering to the United States wasn't just about escaping death. It was about choosing a future. A German soldier who gave himself up in the West wasn't merely ending his war. He was voting with his feet for which post-war Germany he wanted to exist. One reconstructed under Western values, or one carved up under Soviet control. And yet, while the West unraveled in mass capitulation, the East continued to burn with resistance. Why? Because surrender meant something entirely different on each front. In the West, commanders knew that laying down arms could preserve the lives of their men. They could surrender with a chance, however fragile, that those lives might help build a new Germany. In the East, surrender was a roll of the dice, where 1 in 3 never returned. Commanders who had led their men through years of brutal, soul-crushing combat simply could not stomach delivering them into Soviet hands, not without exhausting every other possibility. And there was more at stake than soldiers. The East was drowning in refugees. By early 1945, millions of civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were on the move, fleeing west from the Red Army's approach. They had heard the stories too, stories of revenge, of retribution, of violence repaid in kind. So they ran, on foot, in horse-drawn carts, crammed into overloaded trains, dragging what few possessions they could carry, and behind them, the German army fought not just to delay the enemy, but to shield the fleeing columns of their own people. That final stand in the East was forged from military realism, national loyalty, and personal dread, and yes, from a deep awareness of the crimes Germany had committed. These soldiers knew what they had done, or at the very least, what had been done in their name. But let's be clear, this was not a collective act of atonement. The choice to surrender westward wasn't driven by guilt. It was driven by survival, informed by guilt, shaped by fear, guided by rationality. These were not idealists or philosophers. They were men making the most consequential decision of their lives in the ruins of a collapsing world. They had seen how the Americans treated prisoners with food, medical aid, and respect for international law. They had seen how the Soviets treated enemies with memory, vengeance, and the cold arithmetic of justice. So they chose. And in those final days, the urgency grew even sharper. Even after Germany's unconditional surrender was signed on May 7th in Reims and reaffirmed on May 8th in Berlin, some German units kept fighting, desperate to reach American lines before the armistice took effect. Take the Courland Pocket in Latvia, where Army Group North, isolated since October 1944, finally laid down arms to Soviet forces on May 9th, after the formal grace period had expired. In Czechoslovakia, chaos ruled the final hours of the war. German troops clashed with Soviet forces as they tried to break through to the west. The Prague Uprising, launched on May 5th by Czech resistance fighters, exploded into street-by-street warfare. German units responded with ruthless brutality, not out of loyalty to the Führer, he was dead, but out of sheer terror. They feared being captured by Czech partisans who would surely hand them over to the Soviets. Even after the war was over, especially after, the race west continued. This was no ordinary surrender. This was a decision made not at the barrel of a gun, but at the edge of moral reckoning. It was the final act of a collapsing empire where every soldier had to ask, if I must lose, then who do I lose to? The answer, for nearly 3 million Germans, was clear. They walked west. Only when the American and Soviet armies met, face to face, did the guns at last fall silent. Only when clear demarcation lines were drawn across a shattered continent did the fighting finally, fully, cease. For those German soldiers who had surrendered to the Americans, this was not merely the end of a war. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would shape how they remembered defeat, how they viewed the enemy, and how they envisioned the future. Yes, the Rhine-Wiesenlager period, the temporary camps along the Rhine, was harsh. Conditions were rough. Shelter was minimal. Supplies strained. But it was temporary. Soon, prisoners were transferred to permanent facilities where treatment steadily improved, and most importantly, they lived. Between 1945 and 1948, the majority of German POWs in the West returned home. And what did they return to? They came back to a land in ruins, cities crushed by Allied bombing, infrastructure in tatters, an economy on life support. Their country was now carved into occupation zones, a nation broken in two. But they came back to life. They married, raised children, and built new homes out of rubble. Many became citizens of the newly formed Federal Republic of Germany in the West, while others returned to life under the German Democratic Republic in the East. In the West, many of these returning POWs emerged as pillars of the new democratic society. They had seen America not as an abstract ideal, but as a real system, one that combined military strength with adherence to law, discipline with decency, and power with restraint. They became quiet advocates of Western democracy, supporters of transatlantic cooperation, and eventual contributors to NATO's formation. Their captivity, strange as it sounds, had become a bridge to peace. But in the East, the story turned sharply. Roughly 5 million German soldiers fell into Soviet hands in the war's final months, including 480,000 was taken during the Battle of Berlin alone. For them, surrender did not mean peace, it meant labor. The Soviet Union, bled dry by 26 million deaths, the destruction of 1,100 towns, and the loss of 32,000 factories, saw these men not as former enemies, but as instruments of restitution. Despite formal adherence to the Geneva Conventions, Soviet authorities prioritized reconstruction over prisoner welfare. German POWs were sent to mines, factories, farms, and construction sites, building the new Soviet economy with their bare hands. The years 1945 and 1946 were especially grim. Famine loomed, rations were scarce, and many prisoners simply did not survive. Conditions gradually improved by 1947 as the Soviet system stabilized, but repatriation remained slow. Most of these men did not see home again until between 1947 and 1950, and some, the last of them, were not released until 1956. 11 years after the war's end. The legacy of these surrender decisions went far beyond individual fate. The nearly 3 million Germans who surrendered to the Western Allies became the foundation stones of West German post-war society. They brought back stories, not just of loss, but of American organization, of fairness, of a system that kept its promises even to its enemies. These memories, combined with the Marshall Plan's economic support and the security of the American shield during the Cold War, steered the Federal Republic toward integration with the West. And the architects of this new Germany? Many had once been soldiers who, in 1945, made a choice. They had chosen to surrender not to ideology, but to survival, not to the East, but to the possibility of a different kind of peace. But not all questions could be neatly resolved. What of justice? The millions of German soldiers who surrendered, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, many of them witnesses or participants in the Nazis' war of annihilation, were by and large not prosecuted. War crimes trials focused on high command, SS officials, camp personnel, and those directly involved in documented atrocities. The average Wehrmacht soldier, even if he had served in occupied Ukraine, Belarus, or Russia, even if he had helped carry out orders of destruction, returned to civilian life unjudged and unexamined. The result? A society rebuilt by men who had fought for a criminal regime, but were now reintegrated without legal reckoning. The question of moral accountability remains complex and unresolved to this day. The Soviet approach, meanwhile, reflected different priorities, different trauma, and different goals. Where the West sought to rebuild Germany as a bulwark against communism, the East sought to rebuild itself with German labor. The long internment of POWs in the Soviet Union wasn't just punishment, it was policy, a form of economic reparations extracted through human effort. And so, the division of Germany into West and East, into democracy and socialism, into NATO and Warsaw Pact, was born not just of ideology, but of individual choices made in 1945. A soldier who surrendered west of the Elbe might return to a Marshall Plan-funded suburb, raise a family, and vote in a Bundestag election. A soldier who fell east might return to a Soviet-style apartment block in Leipzig under Stasi surveillance, or not return at all. Thus, in the chaos of surrender, the future was chosen, not in great speeches, not in treaties, but in the quiet, desperate decisions of men with no good options and no clear road ahead. Looking back across the decades, the German surrender of 1945 stands as one of the most extraordinary collapses in military history, not for its speed, but for its precision. This was no chaotic disintegration, no panicked flight. It was something far more calculated. German forces did not simply lay down their arms when all was lost. They laid them down in specific directions to chosen enemies, while continuing to fight others. This was a surrender shaped not by defeat alone, but by choice. Nearly 3 million German soldiers surrendered to the Western Allies, not only to avoid death, but to avoid one fate in particular, Soviet captivity. They surrendered not when they had to, but when they could, and to whom they could. Each of them was making a decision to live, yes, but also to step away from Hitler's war and toward a future where survival might still be possible. They chose survival over honor, the future over the past, American pragmatism over Soviet vengeance. The final ledger of World War II in Europe includes this haunting statistic. The German war effort collapsed completely in the West, where soldiers knew they could surrender and survive. In the East, it ground onto the bitter end, where surrender might mean slow death in captivity or no return at all. The casualty numbers bear out this tragic asymmetry. In the East, German dead and wounded far outnumbered those captured. In the West, German prisoners vastly outnumbered the dead. That divergence cost tens of thousands of lives. Every German soldier killed in battle with the Red Army in 1945 might have lived if fate or geography had placed him opposite American lines. Every Soviet soldier who died in 1945 fell fighting an enemy who was, at that very same moment, surrendering by the tens of thousands in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands. And for the Americans receiving this flood of capitulation, the experience was both validating and deeply sobering. On one hand, the mass surrender affirmed America's image of itself, a power that fought hard but kept to the rules, that honored the Geneva Conventions, that showed restraint even in victory. On the other hand, American commanders understood exactly what was happening. They knew these Germans were not surrendering out of admiration or remorse. They were fleeing justice more than they were seeking mercy. General Eisenhower, in his communications with the Soviets, had to tread carefully, reassuring his allies that there would be no betrayal, even as German prisoners poured into Western camps. He navigated the fragile alliance, knowing that beneath the surface, the war was ending, not in unity, but in the shadow of a coming Cold War. In the years that followed, the echoes of those surrender decisions could be heard in every corner of Europe. West Germany, home to so many men who had laid down their arms before the Americans, became a prosperous democracy, a cornerstone of NATO, and a steadfast American ally. East Germany, where former POWs from Soviet camps eventually settled, became a communist dictatorship, a satellite of Moscow, hemmed in by walls and wire. When Germany reunified in 1990, those wartime choices, made in desperation, often in the final days, still shaped its politics, its alliances, its national psyche. Why did 3 million German soldiers choose the West? Because the contrast was undeniable. In Western captivity, the chance of dying was about 1%. In Soviet hands, it was 1 in 3. And so they walked, not as a disorganized mob, but as a tide of calculated surrender heading west toward life. The 480,000 German soldiers captured in Berlin never had that option. Cut off, surrounded, with no Americans in sight, they fought to the last, and then faced the fate so many of their countrymen had spent months scrambling to avoid. The Germans who surrendered survived, and their survival helped shape the Europe that followed. They did not face American fire in a final battle. They faced American law, American order, American power tempered by restraint, and so they surrendered their weapons and saved their lives. In the brutal arithmetic of war's end, they made the choice that 3 million men facing death might make. They walked toward those most likely to let them live. This choice, to surrender in the West but not in the East, lies at the heart of one of 1945's greatest paradoxes. It explains the dramatic imbalance in German resistance as the Third Reich collapsed. It explains why the Western Front unraveled in weeks, while the Eastern Front fought on to the bitter end. It explains why American forces captured nearly 3 million Germans while suffering comparatively modest casualties, while the Red Army had to claw through every inch of ground, every block, every village, at the cost of rivers of blood. In the final reckoning, the math of Allied victory was not only calculated in tactics or firepower, but in a more intimate arithmetic, the difference between two forms of captivity. In one hand, the West, survival, legal order, the possibility of a future. In the other, the East, vengeance, labor, and an ominous chance that you would never come home. German soldiers knew this. Whatever their crimes, whatever their belief in Nazi ideology, whatever their loyalty to the regime. When they saw the choice clearly, they acted not on ideology, but on the raw human instinct to live. That choice, repeated again and again by millions of individuals in the spring of 1945, collapsed German resistance in the West, accelerated the end of the war, and quietly reshaped the world to come. It was not made in parliaments or at command posts, but in hedgerows and forests, in quiet surrenders at village crossroads, in broken columns walking west with hands raised. It was the choice that ensured that for millions of German soldiers, the enemy they surrendered to would one day become an ally, that Germany would be rebuilt, not obliterated, that the Cold War map would be drawn in part by the direction a soldier walked when given the chance. And for those who had no such chance, those encircled in Berlin, those caught in the last battles of the East, their fate was sealed not just by military defeat, but by the absence of that single critical option. In the brutal calculus of war's end, 3 million men chose to live, and in doing so, helped define the post-war order that still shapes our world today.